Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm going to be talking about Hosea today. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. During the first part of his time as prophet, Jeroboam II was on the throne. Jeroboam II was king during a time of really significant prosperity and peace for the northern nation of Israel. What had happened was the local difficulties that they'd been experiencing with the nation of Aram had been put an end to by Assyria coming and conquering Aram and destroying Damascus, and or at least conquering Damascus, and as a result, although Israel was I think a vassal of Assyria at that point, they still experienced quite a lot of prosperity and peace. That's the setting for the first part of Hosea's ministry. However, Hosea continues to be prophet to the nation during the unsettled period that we talked about when we were looking at the Book of Kings, where we have coup after coup after coup, and no king sort of manages to stay on the throne for more than a couple of years, and sometimes much shorter time than that. And must have been a time of great turmoil and time that would have been very scary, I think, to live through. And then finally Assyria conquers the northern territory, the northern nation, I beg your pardon, and excuse me, and takes them away and deports them into exile, as you know. And we don't know what happens to Hosea in that action. So that's his place of ministry, and that's his time of ministry. Now, I've said that the nation was very prosperous to begin with and very peaceful to begin with. Israel was always deeply syncretic. Syncretism is the mixture of religions, and Israel, really since the time that it divided from Judah, has always been that way. So do you remember Jeroboam the first king of the northern nation, set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan. Initially, I think, in trying to indicate that this is the cult of the true God, but that kind of rapidly becomes mixed up with the indigenous religion of the land. It seems like the people sort of intermittently worshipped the true God and Baal, which was one of the gods of the land. And sometimes perhaps even understood these to be two names for the same God. Hosea actually takes issue with that at one point. Don't know if I can immediately find it, but he speaks with God's voice. He says, when this happens, when on this day you will no longer call me my Baal, suggesting that they were already doing that. So the book of Hosea, what we've essentially got is the first 3 chapters are an acted parable. We've spoken quite a lot about prophetic action, and we have another one here, quite a protracted one, in the first 3 chapters. And then chapters 4 to 14, which is the rest of the book, really contain the indictment that kind of explains and fleshes out the meaning of that parable. So the acted parable is this. Hosea is told to go and marry a woman who is sexually, what's the word I'm looking for? We can't say unfaithful before they're married, but who is sexually active with men, which in that society would have been extremely frowned upon, more than that really. And he is told to marry such a woman, which I think no man in that day would have voluntarily done. And not only that then, but she continues to be sexually promiscuous after their marriage, and she leaves him on at least one occasion for other lovers. And the children that she bears are probably not his children. So she bears a son first, probably his son at this point, and he is named Jezreel. And Jezreel was the name of the place where Jehu, Jeroboam's one of Jeroboam's predecessors, had killed the house of Ahab, had slaughtered them all. And this son is called Jezreel, because God says, I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel because of the blood that was shed there. So that's the first son, and these sons are being given kind of prophetic names. And then she has another child, and this is a daughter. And God says, name this daughter No Mercy, Lo Rahma, because I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel. And then she conceives and has another son, and God says, call this one Not My People, Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And then there's this poem in chapter 2 where he kind of says to his children, plead with your mother, for she is not my wife and I am not her husband. Plead with her that she stop being unfaithful to me. And he makes kind of some threats, which are kind of mixed metaphor here. But he speaks about making her like a wilderness, making her like a parched land, killing her with thirst. I will hedge her. This is verse 6 of this chapter. I will hedge her way with thorns. I will build a wall against her. She will pursue her lovers but not overtake them. She shall seek them and not find them. Verse 10 of a verse we're going to come back to in a moment. I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. So there is this quite strong language of how Hosea is going to treat his wife, or how God is going to treat Israel, using the image of Hosea and his wife as a metaphor. And in chapter 3, a really striking, very little chapter, but really striking one. The Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel. Though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. I don't think we're supposed to infer that raisin cakes are inherently evil, which is, I'm pleased to say, because I've just enjoyed a simnel cake. But there's something about these raisin cakes that's to do with the worship of these false gods. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver. So he's buying her back from her lovers. He's paying hard cash to bring his wife back to his family home. So that's the parable. It's this parable of a man who voluntarily marries a woman he knows will be unfaithful, has her back after several episodes of unfaithfulness, and in the end spends his own money to buy her back and redeem her back to be his wife again. And then in chapters 4 to 14, as I've said, we get the the accusation against Israel, where God is kind of saying, you are like Hosea's unfaithful wife in these respects. And in particular, we get the sort of idea that it is prosperity that is making Israel unfaithful. One of the charges, one of the things that God says is, you go after your lovers, and they give you all this, and all this stuff which I have given you, all these blessings which I have given you. You say you're getting them from your lovers. This idea that God is blessing the nation at this season, and yet they are thanking the gods of the false gods for these blessings rather than turning to the true God. Chapter 10 verse 1 is a little example there. Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built to other gods. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. These pillars were sites of pagan worship. Perhaps you get the idea. Now, we've got this extended parable at the beginning, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But it's worth noticing that Hosea uses a lot of metaphors for God, some quite striking ones, actually. So God compares himself through the mouth of Hosea as a festering, as the pus in a wound, or the mould or dry rot, which doesn't usually make its way into our worship songs. Perhaps that's a challenge for you. Write a worship song to use on a Sunday morning that compares God to festering rot. Perhaps not. God compares himself to a lion or a leopard in chapter 13. He compares himself to a pine tree in chapter 14. Israel is described as being like a furnace in chapter 7, a stubborn heifer in chapter 4, like dew, like a vessel. I can't remember if that's what sort of vessel that is, actually. Hang on. 8 verse 8. It's not clear, probably a boat, but I'm not quite clear what sort of vessel actually. A stick in chapter 10. Silly birds in chapter 11. Let's look that one up. Chapter 11, verse 11. Hosea compares himself to they will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria. And like chaff or smoke in chapter 13. So lots of metaphor, lots of imagery. Now, what I want to spend the rest of my time with you today talking about is this metaphor, this sexual imagery, and the narrative punishment that we see in Hosea 1-3. Because some people find this very troubling. Let me just tell you a story. When I was a teenager, and some of you may remember this, I went to Spring Harvest. I don't know when it was, in the 80s. And they had some what they called minor seminar streams in those days. And the minor seminar stream I went to is all on the minor prophets. And I chose to go to one on Hosea, which was the first time I had ever really encountered the book or thought about it. And it was this series of seminars on Hosea was led by, if I remember correctly, Alex and Peggy Buchanan. And they entitled this God's Covenant Love. And they wove this beautiful, beautiful story of the faithful love of Hosea for his wife, who didn't deserve his faithful love, who broke the marriage covenant again and again and again. And yet Hosea kept having his wife back, and how this is a picture of the way God continually forgives us. And I think this beautiful picture is how we are intended to read Hosea. But as I have read it more and more, especially in the context of, I don't know if I've mentioned, but I've got a book coming out later this year on domestic abuse. And I've also been writing quite a lot about sexual abuse or sexual violence. And in reading it in that context, it does feel a lot more troublesome than that rather lovely narrative that I heard at Spring Harvest back in the day, although I think that is the intention of the writer. But to modern ears, and certainly to ears, to those of us who have thought hard about these issues or who have indeed experienced sexual violence, I think this can come across quite troubling, and I'd like to make a few comments about this. First of all, it's not entirely clear whether Hosea actually did this, whether this is a true description of a man and his wife, or whether this is a parable that is kind of being told to us or acted in front of us, as it were. Now, whether that makes a difference or not to how we feel about it, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's worth making that comment at the beginning. The second thing to say is that the use of the language of Gomer, the wife, as a prostitute, as a whore, as some of the translations have it, has been has what's the word I'm looking for? Emboldened traditional commentators, particularly male commentators, to be really derogatory about women. And in particular, I think, to fail to understand the forces that are at work in this ancient world that might drive a woman to live in a way that is sexually improper, particularly if she doesn't have a husband. A woman who has no protector, I think I've hinted at this before, a woman who has no protector in this ancient world really has no means of making an income quite often, and this may well mean that she would have to cast herself upon the mercy of the men around her in order to survive. And so before we jump in with 2 feet judging how this woman lived, certainly before her marriage, we should bear that in mind. And some commentators have been rather too gleeful, I think, in their disapproval of this woman and some of the language they have used around her actions. Now, I've said a few times that the metaphor of husband and wife is used quite a lot for God and his people in the Old Testament and indeed into the New. And I think it's worth reflecting on why that is. I think we need to see affection here. We need to see the language of love. And I think although, and I'm going to go on to say this in a minute, what love means much more than affection in the Hebrew Bible. But I don't think it means less than affection. And I think there is affection intended and real passion, real emotional devotion. We're intended to see that in this parable. There is also the implicit assumption in the ancient world that a husband is entitled to punish a disobedient or an unfaithful wife. And that's the way it was in the ancient world. It was not something that was interrogated or challenged, I guess. And we need to understand that that is in operation in order to understand the parable and the metaphor in the way it's being used, and then in order to understand how we might take that away and use it, and how we shouldn't take it away and use it. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I'll say a bit more about it now. A metaphor is intended to show us from something that we're familiar with, show us something, teach us something about something we're less familiar with. So the writer of this book is speaking about something that his world will be very familiar with, the idea of relationship between a husband and man and his wife, and between and how that relationship breaks down when a partner is unfaithful. And he's referring to that very familiar idea in order to teach about God and to teach about God's people. What we should not do, first of all, is assume that everything that is true about abusive husbands can then be projected onto God. That is not what Hosea is doing. There's a limit to his metaphor. But also metaphors work in one direction. They do not work in the other direction. Hosea is not giving us a marriage manual here. We're not supposed to draw conclusions about how to be married. We are supposed to understand what marriage looked like then and learn about God. And from what we know about God, we might then learn about how to be in general. But we're not drawing conclusions about how to be in marriage now compared to how Hosea viewed marriage then. Interestingly, this personification of the people of God as a woman, which is quite common, has a sexual component, really only quite rarely in the Bible. Most of the time, it's not personifying a woman in a sexual way. Quite often it's to do with, it uses the image of a proud, wealthy woman who's dressed very richly and is kind of walking about with her nose in the air. And that's the image of kind of high-handed pride that is being used to describe the people, rather than a sexual image. Now, what does love mean in the Bible? It does mean emotion, I think. We do see very clearly emotional connection between husbands and wives in these texts. But it means much more than that. And I think love means a determined commitment to the welfare of the other. A faithful loyalty. The idea of love is about faithfulness and commitment and a determined commitment to serve and bless, much more than it means something emotional. And I think we need to understand that as part of the wider context of the personification of God and how he's described and how his emotions are described. And we need to not overinterpret his emotions, because our emotions are very fickle and they're very unreliable and they lead us into sin sometimes. And when we project that onto God, I think that's really unhelpful. Now, I want to come back to the verse that I flagged up briefly, chapter 2, verse 10, where this woman is, in this metaphor, is being punished by being stripped in the sight of her lovers. Now, this is, if you like, a bit of a kind of an eye for an eye thing. She has been naked with her lovers, one assumes, if she's been unfaithful to Hosea, and therefore she is, in this parable, being stripped in front of her lovers. It's kind of, you can see that it's kind of an eye for an eye thing. But this is not the punishment of an unfaithful wife according to the law of Leviticus or Deuteronomy. And what an unfaithful wife in Leviticus or Deuteronomy gets stoned to death. That is the punishment for an unfaithful wife. And so the very use of this bizarre punishment, which if you think about it, no husband is likely to want to do to his wife, because a husband, we need to understand, is deeply shamed in this ancient world by his wife's unfaithfulness. So the idea that he would then increase his shame by kind of reenacting her offence by stripping her in front of other men is just not how a real man would behave in the real world. And so that immediately takes this parable, takes this metaphor into the realm of the kind of imaginary. This is a kind of thought experiment about how God and his people might relate to one another. It is not intended to be earthed in a real situation or giving any idea of how a real situation ought to play out. We should notice that this corporate image of the sexually unfaithful woman as Israel, of course, includes men and women. In fact, I would go beyond that and I would say it is primarily addressed at men. The prophet's words are addressed against a nation that is acting unfaithfully towards God, that is acting idolatrously, that is acting in ways that are socially abusive, social injustice. Now, in a world where there is a huge power imbalance and where men lead the household, most of those crimes would be led by the men. It's not to say women were sin-free, of course, but this is a male-led society. And so the prophet's indictment falls more heavily upon men than it does on women. And that makes this imagery of Israel as a sexually unfaithful woman actually quite potent, because it is even more shaming to these ancient Middle Eastern men who would be very much standing on their own dignity and their pride. And to be compared to a prostitute would have been appalling to them, really appalling to them. And we need to notice the strength of the prophetic critique and that it falls primarily upon men. Derek Kidner, who's written perhaps a slightly dated commentary now about Hosea, perhaps doesn't appreciate some of the modern resonances that this book will have, but nonetheless he has some really helpful things to say. And he makes the comment, he says, what options are open to a parent or a teacher or a judge when somebody, when a child or a member of society is disobedient, is rebellious? He says you've got three options. You can play it cool, you can play it tough, or you can be tender towards them. And he says we see all of these in the book of Hosea. In Hosea, God plays it cool. We get language of he has withdrawn from them. Ephraim, Israel, of course that means, is joined to idols, let him alone, playing it cool. God plays it tough. I will be like a lion to them. Or Hosea says, God will punish their sins. But above all, God is tender. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? My heart recoils within me. I will heal their faithfulness. Plead with your mother, because she is not behaving like my wife. Tenderness. So we get coolness, distancing. We get punishment, but we also get tenderness in this book. And finally, I think we need to know. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the interpretation of the prodigal son, where we understand the father, this Middle Eastern man from the time of Jesus, who would very much have stood on his own dignity, and the idea that he hitches up his skirts and runs down to greet his son is unthinkable, really. Jesus is telling a story that is absolutely astonishing, because this man is degrading his own dignity in order to go and greet his disobedient son. And we have something similar going on here. The idea that a man would go down to the marketplace or to another man's house and spend his own cash on buying back an unfaithful wife is utterly ludicrous. A wife by her unfaithfulness brings shame upon her husband in the ancient worldview, and there is no way that such a shamed husband would make public his shame even more and would compound his shame by bringing her back into the home, let alone paying money to do so. And yet this is the image that God is using here to describe his own actions towards his disobedient people and his own love for his disobedient people. So I hope we can get past the difficulties that this metaphor presents to us in this generation, and understand the truth that Hosea is wanting to communicate, which is something about God's covenant loyalty and his tenderness and his love for his people, even when we are disobedient. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow for Joel.